Step beyond the headlines and experience the reality of the courtroom. The material you are viewing is entirely unfiltered and unedited. This is raw, documented footage from the front lines of justice, bringing you face to face with the unyielding truth.
Step away from the door! Step back!
This is my home. I've already shown you my
Don't tell me how to do my job! Innocent people don't act like this!
You do not have probable cause.
Put the phone down right now or you're going to jail!
The doorbell camera captured everything. A quiet Tuesday evening in an upscale neighborhood, the kind of place where million-dollar homes sit behind manicured lawns and children ride their bikes safely down tree-lined streets. At exactly 7:43 p.m., a black sedan pulled into the driveway of 1247 Elmwood Drive. The driver stepped out, walked to the front door, and reached for her keys. What happened next would destroy 2 police careers, spark a federal investigation, and prove that even the most powerful people in America are not immune to the prejudice that still lurks in our justice system. This woman wasn't just any homeowner. She was Justice Sandra Coleman, one of 9 people who sit on the highest court in the land, and the officers who were about to make the worst decision of their professional lives had no idea who they were about to confront. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because what unfolds here will shock you. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this ends. Justice Coleman had just returned from a 3-day judicial conference in Chicago. She was tired, carrying her briefcase and a small overnight bag, looking forward to a quiet evening at home with her cat and a cup of tea. At 52 years old, she had been serving on the Supreme Court for 4 years, appointed after a distinguished career as a federal appeals court judge. She was known for her sharp legal mind, her thoughtful questions during oral arguments, and her ability to find common ground between opposing viewpoints. The neighborhood she lived in was called Riverside Heights, an exclusive community where doctors, lawyers, and business executives made their homes. Justice Coleman had purchased the house 2 years earlier, a beautiful colonial with white columns and a wraparound porch. She loved the quiet streets and the sense of privacy it provided from her very public professional life. As she fumbled with her keys at the front door, 2 police officers were driving slowly through the neighborhood on routine patrol. Officer Jake Morrison was behind the wheel, a 15-year veteran of the force with a reputation for being thorough, perhaps too thorough. His partner that night was Officer David Walsh, younger and less experienced, but eager to prove himself to his senior colleague. Morrison noticed the black sedan in the driveway, and something about the scene caught his attention. He told Walsh to slow down. He watched as Justice Coleman approached the front door, keys in hand, and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw what he believed was a suspicious person attempting to break into an expensive home in an affluent neighborhood. Without running the license plate, without observing for more than 30 seconds, without considering any alternative explanations for what he was seeing, Morrison pulled the patrol car to the curb and got out. Walsh followed, uncertain but trusting his partner's judgment. They approached the house just as Justice Coleman was inserting her key into the lock. The interaction began simply enough. Morrison called out, asking if everything was okay. Justice Coleman turned around, surprised to see 2 uniformed officers walking up her driveway. She responded politely that yes, everything was fine, she was just coming home. But Morrison pressed further. He asked if she lived there. She said yes, this was her house. He asked for identification. Now, here's where the situation could have gone differently. Justice Coleman could have immediately identified herself as a Supreme Court justice. She could have demanded to speak to their supervisor. She could have become indignant and confrontational. Instead, she remained calm and compliant, perhaps curious to see how far this would go. She reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license, handing it to Officer Morrison. Morrison examined the license, comparing the address to the house number. Everything matched perfectly. The license was clearly legitimate, but instead of apologizing and leaving, he became more suspicious. He asked Justice Coleman what she was doing in the neighborhood. She explained again that she lived there and was returning from a business trip. He asked what kind of business. She said she worked for the federal government, Officer Walsh later testified that he began to feel uncomfortable at this point. He could see that the woman had a key to the house, that her identification matched the address, and that she was being completely cooperative. But Morrison seemed determined to find something wrong with the situation. Morrison asked Justice Coleman to step away from the door. He said he needed to verify that she actually lived there. She asked how he intended to do that, and he said he wanted to look through the windows to see if there were signs of forced entry. This was completely unnecessary and arguably unlawful, but Justice Coleman stepped aside and allowed him to peer through her front windows. Through the glass, Morrison could see a beautifully furnished living room with family photos on the mantelpiece, mail stacked on a side table, and a cat sleeping on the sofa. Everything suggested this was clearly someone's well-established home, but Morrison wasn't satisfied. He returned to Justice Coleman and told her he needed to see inside the house to make sure everything was legitimate. This is when Justice Coleman finally pushed back. She politely but firmly explained that he had no probable cause to enter her home, that she had provided identification proving she lived there, and that she had done nothing wrong. She told him she was within her rights to refuse entry without a warrant. Her tone remained professional and controlled, but there was steel in her voice that should have warned Morrison he was dealing with someone who understood the law better than he did. Morrison's response revealed the true nature of what was happening. He told Justice Coleman that she was being uncooperative and that her refusal to allow them inside made her look suspicious. He said that in his experience, innocent people had nothing to hide. He suggested that someone who really lived in such an expensive house would want to clear up any misunderstanding quickly. The implication was clear and deeply offensive. Morrison was suggesting that Justice Coleman didn't belong in this neighborhood, that her presence in front of this expensive home was inherently suspicious, and that her knowledge of her constitutional rights was somehow evidence of guilt rather than innocence. Justice Coleman made a decision that would prove to be brilliant. She pulled out her phone and began recording the interaction. She announced clearly that she was recording for her own protection and asked Morrison to state his name and badge number for the record. This simple action changed everything about the dynamic of the encounter. Morrison immediately became defensive. He told her to put the phone away. She calmly refused, explaining that she had every right to record police officers performing their duties in a public space. Morrison stepped closer to her, invading her personal space in what appeared to be an attempt at intimidation. He told her that if she didn't comply with his instructions, she would be arrested for obstruction of justice. This threat was legally baseless, and Morrison knew it. You cannot arrest someone for exercising their constitutional rights on their own property, but he was now trapped in a situation of his own making, having gone too far to back down gracefully. Officer Walsh later said he wanted to suggest they leave, but Morrison was his senior partner, and he didn't feel comfortable contradicting him in front of a civilian. Justice Coleman asked Morrison what specific crime he suspected her of committing. He couldn't give a coherent answer. She asked what evidence he had that she didn't live at this address. He pointed to her nice clothes and expensive car, saying they seemed inconsistent with someone who would live in this neighborhood. The racism in this statement was stunning in its boldness. At this point, neighbors began to notice the commotion. Porch lights came on across the street. A woman walking her dog stopped to watch from a distance. An elderly man came out of his house 2 doors down to see what was happening. Justice Coleman was aware of the growing audience, but she remained focused on the officers, continuing to record and asking calm, pointed questions that exposed the complete lack of justification for their actions. Morrison told Justice Coleman she was under arrest. When she asked what charges, he said disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. She pointed out that she couldn't be resisting arrest if she hadn't been lawfully arrested in the first place, and that standing quietly on her own property while asking reasonable questions didn't constitute disorderly conduct. Her legal analysis was flawless, but Morrison was beyond reason now. He reached for his handcuffs and told her to turn around. Justice Coleman did not resist, but she continued recording and speaking clearly for the benefit of the camera. She stated her name, the date, the time, and the address. She said she was being unlawfully arrested on her own property for no apparent reason other than the color of her skin. She remained calm and dignified even as Morrison roughly handcuffed her behind her back. Officer Walsh finally found his voice and suggested they call a supervisor. Morrison snapped at him to be quiet and helped get the suspect into the patrol car. But Walsh was beginning to understand that something was very wrong with this arrest. He had seen Justice Coleman's identification, watched her unlock her own front door with her own key, and observed her calm and lawful behavior throughout the encounter. Nothing about this felt right. As Morrison led Justice Coleman toward the police car, she made one final statement that would soon become famous. She said clearly and calmly, "Officer Morrison, you are making a very serious mistake. I am Justice Sandra Coleman of the United States Supreme Court, and what you are doing right now is a violation of my civil rights and a federal crime. I suggest you reconsider your actions before this goes any further." Morrison laughed. He actually laughed. He told her that everyone claimed to be someone important when they got arrested, and that her lies were only making things worse for her. He said if she really was some kind of judge, she would have said so from the beginning instead of trying to break into someone else's house. The irony was devastating. Here was a police officer, sworn to uphold the law, arresting one of the 9 people in America who had the ultimate authority to interpret that law. And he was doing it based on nothing more than racial prejudice and his own inflated ego. Justice Coleman's calm response had been strategic. She had wanted to see exactly how far this would go, how badly these officers would violate her rights, and how clear their motivations really were. As they reached the patrol car, Morrison opened the back door and began to push Justice Coleman inside. That's when everything changed. Officer Walsh's radio crackled to life with a message that would turn this routine evening into a career-ending disaster for both men. The radio message came from dispatch, and Officer Walsh's face went pale as he listened. A neighbor had called 911 to report what appeared to be police harassment of a black woman at 1247 Elmwood Drive. The caller specifically mentioned that the woman had keys to the house and seemed to live there, but officers were arresting her anyway. Dispatch was asking for a status update and requesting that a supervisor respond to the scene immediately. Morrison heard the radio call and his jaw tightened. He realized that his actions were now under scrutiny, but instead of reconsidering, he doubled down. He told dispatch that they had the situation under control and were transporting a suspect for attempted burglary. This was a complete fabrication. There had been no burglary, no attempt at burglary, and no evidence of any criminal activity whatsoever. Justice Coleman spoke up from the back of the patrol car, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet evening air. She said that she wanted the radio transmission recorded, that she was being falsely imprisoned, and that Officer Morrison had just committed perjury by lying to dispatch. Her legal training was evident in every word she chose. She wasn't emotional or angry. She was building a case. Within minutes, Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez arrived on scene. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran known for her fairness and professionalism. She had been Morrison's supervisor for 3 years and had occasionally wondered about some of his arrest patterns, but had never seen anything this blatant. She parked her vehicle and approached the patrol car where Justice Coleman sat in handcuffs. Rodriguez asked Morrison for a quick briefing on what had happened. Morrison explained that they had observed suspicious activity at the residence, that the suspect couldn't adequately explain her presence, and that she had become belligerent and uncooperative when questioned. Every word was either misleading or an outright lie, and Rodriguez could sense something was wrong with the story. She walked to the patrol car and looked through the window at Justice Coleman. What she saw was a well-dressed, middle-aged woman sitting calmly with her hands cuffed behind her back. There was no sign of intoxication, no indication of mental illness, no evidence of the aggressive behavior Morrison had described. Justice Coleman met her eyes and spoke clearly through the window. She identified herself by name and title, explained that she lived at this address, and said that she had been unlawfully arrested while trying to enter her own home. She asked Sergeant Rodriguez to check her identification, which was still in Morrison's possession, and to verify her identity through official channels. Her tone was respectful but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to and taken seriously. Rodriguez walked back to Morrison and asked to see the woman's identification. Morrison handed over the driver's license, and Rodriguez immediately noticed that the address matched exactly. She also noticed something else that made her stomach drop. The name on the license was Sandra Coleman, and Rodriguez suddenly realized where she had heard that name before. It was the same name that had been in the news just 2 weeks earlier when the Supreme Court had issued a major ruling on police accountability. Rodriguez asked Morrison if he had run a background check on the suspect. Morrison said he hadn't seen the need since she was obviously lying about living there. Rodriguez walked to her patrol car and ran Justice Coleman's name through the system. What came back on her computer screen confirmed her worst fears. Sandra Coleman, age 52, no criminal history, current address 1247 Elmwood Drive, occupation listed as federal judge. Rodriguez stared at the screen for a long moment, understanding that her department was about to face a crisis unlike anything in its history. She walked back to Morrison and Walsh, her expression grim. She told Morrison to uncuff the suspect immediately and asked him to explain exactly what probable cause he had for the arrest. Morrison became defensive, saying that the suspect had been uncooperative and that something about the situation hadn't felt right. Rodriguez asked him to be more specific. What exactly had Justice Coleman done that constituted a crime? Morrison couldn't give a coherent answer. He mentioned that she had expensive clothes and a nice car, that she had refused to let them search her house, and that she had been recording them on her phone. Rodriguez realized that Morrison had just described a series of completely legal activities performed by someone on their own property. She also realized that his reasoning revealed a disturbing pattern of racial bias. She immediately called for additional supervisors and notified the watch commander that they had a serious situation requiring immediate attention. Justice Coleman was released from the handcuffs and offered a sincere apology by Sergeant Rodriguez. But Justice Coleman wasn't interested in apologies. She wanted names, badge numbers, and assurance that this incident would be thoroughly investigated. She also wanted the dash cam footage, the body camera footage, and copies of all radio transmissions related to the incident. Rodriguez assured her that everything would be preserved and that an investigation would begin immediately. But Justice Coleman knew that internal police investigations often went nowhere, especially when they involved accusations of racial bias. She had seen too many cases where officers received minor discipline or were quietly transferred to other departments. As more supervisors arrived on scene, the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. Lieutenant James Parker, a 25-year veteran, took one look at the situation and immediately began damage control. He separated Morrison and Walsh, ordering them not to discuss the incident with each other or anyone else until they could be formally interviewed. Justice Coleman declined medical attention but accepted an offer to have crime scene technicians photograph the minor abrasions on her wrists where the handcuffs had been too tight. She understood the importance of documenting every aspect of what had occurred. She also requested that the neighbor who had called 911 be identified so she could thank them for their intervention. The neighbor turned out to be Margaret Foster, a retired school teacher who lived across the street. Foster had been watching from her window and had become concerned when she saw officers handcuffing someone at Justice Coleman's house. She knew Justice Coleman by sight and had occasionally waved to her when she was working in her garden. Foster told investigators that she had never seen anything suspicious at that address and that Justice Coleman was a quiet, respectful neighbor. Other neighbors began coming forward with similar accounts. Several had seen Justice Coleman coming and going regularly for the 2 years she had lived there. Some had spoken with her at neighborhood association meetings. A few had even borrowed tools or shared gardening tips with her. The picture that emerged was of someone who was clearly an established resident of the community. Meanwhile, Morrison and Walsh were taken to headquarters for separate interviews. Morrison remained defensive, insisting that he had followed proper procedures and that anyone would have been suspicious of someone trying to enter such an expensive house. His language revealed the depth of his bias, repeatedly referring to the type of person who usually lived in that neighborhood. Walsh's interview painted a different picture. He admitted that he had felt uncomfortable with the arrest from the beginning. He said that Justice Coleman had been cooperative throughout the encounter and that her identification clearly established her right to be at that address. He acknowledged that he should have spoken up, but was reluctant to contradict his senior partner. The investigation moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. The doorbell camera had captured the entire interaction from multiple angles. The audio was crystal clear, recording every word that had been spoken. There was no ambiguity about what had happened or why it had happened. Body camera footage from both officers corroborated Justice Coleman's account of events. Morrison could be seen becoming increasingly aggressive as the encounter progressed, while Justice Coleman remained calm and reasonable throughout. The footage also clearly showed that she had keys to the house and that her identification matched the address. Radio transmissions revealed that Morrison had lied to dispatch about the nature of the incident. He had reported a burglary in progress when he knew there was no burglary. He had described Justice Coleman as a suspect when she was clearly the homeowner. These false statements constituted official misconduct and potentially criminal behavior. The department's Internal Affairs Division completed their investigation within 72 hours, a speed that reflected both the seriousness of the allegations and the quality of the evidence. Their report concluded that Morrison had violated numerous departmental policies regarding racial profiling, unlawful detention, and false reporting. Walsh was found to have failed in his duty to intervene when he witnessed civil rights violations by his partner. Justice Coleman hired Rebecca Martinez, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. Martinez had won landmark cases against police departments across the nation and had a reputation for holding law enforcement accountable for constitutional violations. Her first move was to file a federal lawsuit under Section 1983, alleging that Justice Coleman's civil rights had been violated under color of law. The lawsuit named Morrison and Walsh as individual defendants, along with the police department and the city. It alleged racial profiling, unlawful detention, false arrest, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. The damages sought were substantial, but more importantly, the lawsuit demanded comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. News of the arrest leaked to the media within days, and the story exploded across national headlines. The image of a Supreme Court justice being handcuffed on her own property became a powerful symbol of how pervasive racial bias remained in American law enforcement. Legal experts called it one of the most egregious examples of racial profiling they had ever seen. Morrison and Walsh were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The police union initially defended them, claiming they had acted reasonably based on the information available at the time. But as more details emerged, even the union began to distance itself from their actions. The FBI opened its own investigation into potential federal civil rights violations. Federal prosecutors began reviewing the case to determine whether criminal charges were warranted. The incident had escalated far beyond a simple personnel matter and was now a federal case with national implications. The media attention intensified when legal scholars began analyzing the broader implications of the case. Professor David Harrison from Harvard Law School appeared on multiple news programs, explaining how the arrest of a sitting Supreme Court justice represented an unprecedented attack on judicial independence. He pointed out that if someone with Justice Coleman's status and legal knowledge could be subjected to such treatment, ordinary citizens had virtually no protection against police misconduct. The footage went viral on social media, sparking nationwide protests and renewed calls for police reform. The hashtag Justice for Justice began trending, with millions of people sharing their own experiences of racial profiling. Civil rights organizations used the incident as a rallying cry, organizing demonstrations in cities across the country. Justice Coleman's colleagues on the Supreme Court issued a rare joint statement condemning the arrest and calling for accountability. Chief Justice William Roberts described the incident as deeply troubling and inconsistent with the principles of equal justice under law. Even justices who rarely agreed on legal issues found common ground in their outrage over what had happened to their colleague. The political ramifications were immediate and severe. Congressional leaders from both parties called for hearings on police accountability. Senator Michael Thompson, chair of the Judiciary Committee, announced plans for comprehensive legislation to address racial profiling in law enforcement. The incident had given new urgency to reform efforts that had been stalled for years. Morrison's history came under intense scrutiny as investigators dug deeper into his record. What they found was a pattern of troubling behavior that had been overlooked or minimized by his supervisors for years. Data analysis revealed that Morrison had arrested black suspects at a rate 3 times higher than his colleagues, while his conviction rate for those arrests was significantly lower than average. Internal affairs records showed 17 previous complaints against Morrison for excessive force or discriminatory conduct. Most had been dismissed after cursory investigations, with Morrison receiving only minor disciplinary actions like written reprimands or brief suspensions. The pattern suggested a department that was either unwilling or unable to address obvious problems with one of its officers. Former colleagues began speaking anonymously to reporters about Morrison's behavior. Several described him as someone who seemed to enjoy exercising power over people he perceived as inferior. One retired officer said Morrison had frequently made racist comments in the locker room and had bragged about putting certain types of people in their place. The psychological evaluation ordered by the department painted a disturbing picture of Morrison's mindset. The psychologist noted signs of authoritarian personality disorder and deep-seated racial bias that had likely influenced his policing decisions for years. The evaluation recommended that Morrison receive extensive counseling and be prohibited from working in law enforcement. Walsh's situation was more complicated. While he had clearly failed to intervene, his background check revealed no previous complaints or signs of bias. Colleagues described him as generally fair and professional, suggesting that his failure was more about inexperience and poor judgment than malicious intent. However, his silence during the arrest had enabled Morrison's misconduct to continue. The police union's initial defense of the officers crumbled as more evidence emerged. Union President Robert Hayes eventually issued a statement acknowledging that the officers' actions were indefensible and announcing that the union would not oppose their termination. This represented a significant shift for an organization that typically defended officers regardless of the circumstances. Federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against both officers within 6 weeks of the incident. Morrison was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony that carried a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. He also faced state charges of false imprisonment, filing false reports, and official misconduct. Walsh was charged with failure to intervene, a newer federal offense that had been created in response to high-profile police misconduct cases. While the potential sentence was shorter than Morrison's charges, a conviction would still result in significant prison time and the permanent loss of his law enforcement career. The grand jury that reviewed the case deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning indictments against both officers. The evidence was so overwhelming that prosecutors described it as one of the clearest cases of civil rights violations they had ever seen. The doorbell camera footage alone was sufficient to prove every element of the charges. Morrison's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but federal prosecutors were unwilling to reduce the charges, given the high-profile nature of the case and the need to send a strong message about accountability. Morrison would have to face trial and risk the maximum penalty if convicted. Justice Coleman used her platform to advocate for broader reforms while her case moved through the courts. She gave speeches at law schools and civil rights conferences, sharing her experience and calling for systemic changes to address racial bias in policing. Her voice carried unique authority because she had experienced discrimination firsthand, despite her position of power. The city where the incident occurred faced mounting pressure to reform its police department. The mayor announced the appointment of a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate misconduct complaints. The police chief was forced to resign and was replaced by an outsider with a track record of implementing meaningful reforms. New training programs were implemented focusing on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Officers were required to complete 40 hours of cultural competency training annually. Body cameras became mandatory for all patrol officers, and the footage was subject to regular review by supervisors and civilian monitors. The department's hiring practices were overhauled to screen out candidates with histories of bias or excessive force complaints from other agencies. Psychological evaluations became more comprehensive. with specific attention paid to identifying officers who might abuse their authority or target certain communities. Community policing initiatives were expanded to rebuild trust between officers and residents. Regular forums were established where citizens could voice concerns and provide feedback about police interactions. The department committed to transparency by publishing detailed statistics about arrests, use of force incidents, and complaint investigations. Morrison's trial began 8 months after the arrest. The courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and members of the community. Justice Coleman testified for 3 hours, describing in detail what had happened that evening and how it had affected her personally and professionally. Her testimony was devastating for the defense. Speaking in the same calm, measured tone she used from the Supreme Court bench, Justice Coleman methodically dismantled every excuse Morrison's attorney tried to offer. She explained how each of Morrison's actions had violated clearly established constitutional principles that any police officer should understand. The defense attempted to portray Morrison as a dedicated officer who had made an honest mistake in a tense situation. But the prosecution played the doorbell camera footage multiple times, showing that there was nothing tense about the situation until Morrison created the tension through his aggressive and unlawful behavior. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of racial profiling and the broader harm it causes to community trust in law enforcement. They explained how Morrison's actions fit a classic pattern of bias-driven policing that has plagued American law enforcement for generations. Character witnesses for Morrison painted a picture of a man who was helpful to neighbors and devoted to his family. But their testimonials rang hollow when contrasted with the clear evidence of his professional misconduct and the pattern of bias revealed in his arrest records. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Morrison. They found that he had willfully violated Justice Coleman's constitutional rights and that his actions were motivated by racial animus. The conviction carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 2 years in federal prison. Walsh's trial was shorter and less dramatic. His attorney argued that he was a young officer following the lead of an experienced partner and that he had no history of discriminatory behavior. The prosecution acknowledged these factors but maintained that officers have a duty to intervene when they witness civil rights violations. The jury found Walsh guilty of failure to intervene, but recommended leniency in sentencing given his cooperation with investigators and his apparent remorse for his actions. His conviction effectively ended his law enforcement career, but he avoided the lengthy prison sentence that Morrison faced. Morrison was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed in that jurisdiction for a civil rights violation. The judge noted that Morrison's abuse of authority was particularly egregious because it involved targeting someone based solely on race while she was on her own property. The sentence was intended to send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Walsh received 18 months in prison and 3 years of supervised probation. The judge acknowledged his lesser role in the incident, but emphasized that his failure to act had enabled Morrison's misconduct to continue. His sentence included mandatory community service with civil rights organizations and ongoing bias training. The civil lawsuit against the city resulted in a $12 million settlement, one of the largest ever awarded in a racial profiling case. More importantly, the settlement included a consent decree requiring ongoing federal oversight of the police department for 5 years. Every aspect of the department's operations would be monitored to ensure compliance with constitutional standards. Justice Coleman donated most of the settlement money to organizations working on police reform and civil rights advocacy. She established a scholarship fund for law students from underrepresented communities who were committed to pursuing careers in civil rights law. Her goal was to ensure that more voices like hers would be heard in courtrooms across the country. The incident had far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate participants. Police departments nationwide began reviewing their policies and training programs to prevent similar incidents. The case became a standard example in law enforcement academies of how racial bias can lead to catastrophic legal and professional consequences. Justice Coleman returned to her duties on the Supreme Court with renewed perspective on the issues of criminal justice and civil rights that regularly came before the court. Her experience gave her unique insight into how the law operated in practice, not just in theory. Her questions during oral arguments became even more pointed when cases involved police misconduct or racial discrimination. The neighborhood where the arrest occurred also changed in subtle but meaningful ways. Residents became more aware of the need to speak up when they witnessed injustice. Several neighbors who had watched the incident from their windows expressed regret that they hadn't intervened more quickly. Community watch programs were restructured to focus on actual safety issues rather than suspicion based on appearance. So there you have it, a simple evening at home that turned into a national reckoning with racial bias in law enforcement. Morrison's 8-year prison sentence and Walsh's career destruction sent shockwaves through police departments everywhere. Justice Coleman's courage to document and pursue justice changed policies nationwide and proved that accountability is possible when people refuse to stay silent. This case was intense, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.
Step beyond the headlines and experience the reality of the courtroom. The material you are viewing is entirely unfiltered and unedited. This is raw, documented footage from the front lines of justice, bringing you face to face with the unyielding truth.